Somewhere right now, someone is stealing your data, not to use it today, but to unlock it years from now. It's called Harvest now, Decrypt Later, and it's the quiet reason Microsoft just tore up its own quantum security roadmap. The company that built the operating system running on more than 1 billion machines just admitted the future is arriving faster than anyone planned for. This is the story of why and what it means for every device you own. Let's start with what actually happened, because the headlines can make this sound more dramatic than it is, and in some ways, less dramatic than it really is. In the first days of July 2026, Microsoft announced that it was accelerating its quantum safe security roadmap. That's a formal way of saying the company is speeding up the timeline for replacing the encryption that protects almost everything digital in your life. Passwords, banking transactions, medical records, private messages, software updates, even the invisible handshake your browser makes with a website before you type in a single character. All of it depends on encryption standards that have quietly protected the modern world for decades. Microsoft just said those standards need to be replaced sooner than it previously believed, and it set a new target, 2029. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a quantum computer actually threatens. A traditional computer, the one you're probably watching this on, stores information as bits, each one either a 0 or a 1. Every photo, every file, every login is ultimately just a long string of those two values. A quantum computer works differently. Instead of bits, it uses qubits, which can exist in a strange in-between state called superposition, effectively representing 0 and 1 at the same time. That property, combined with another quantum effect called entanglement, allows a sufficiently powerful quantum computer to explore a staggering number of possibilities simultaneously. For most everyday tasks, this offers no advantage at all, but for a narrow category of mathematical problems, it could be transformative, and one of those problems happens to be the exact math that underlies modern public key encryption. Public key encryption is the invisible infrastructure of the internet. It's what allows your phone to securely connect to your bank, without a hacker sitting on the same coffee shop Wi-Fi being able to read your account balance. It's what lets a browser verify that a website is really who it claims to be. It works because certain mathematical problems, like factoring extremely large numbers, are effectively impossible for classical computers to solve in a reasonable amount of time. Not impossible in a philosophical sense, impossible in the sense that it would take longer than the age of the universe using every computer on Earth working together. That difficulty is the entire security model. It's not that the code is unbreakable, it's that breaking it would take too long to matter. It's worth remembering that this kind of encryption isn't some obscure technical detail buried deep in the plumbing of the internet. The algorithm most commonly used to secure this handshake, known as RSA, has been quietly protecting digital communication since the late 1970s. It has survived nearly 5 decades of attempts to break it, not because nobody has tried, but because the math genuinely holds up against every classical computer humanity has ever built. That's an extraordinary track record. And it's part of why the idea of a machine that could undermine it feels, to a lot of people, more like science fiction than an engineering roadmap. But cryptographers have known for decades that this particular kind of math has a theoretical weakness, one that only becomes exploitable if a very specific, very difficult kind of computer is ever built. A sufficiently powerful, error-corrected quantum computer changes that equation entirely. Using an algorithm developed by mathematician Peter Shor back in the 1990s, a quantum computer with enough stable qubits could, in theory, factor those massive numbers in a fraction of the time a classical computer would need. The operative word there is could. Nobody has built a machine capable of doing this yet. Today's quantum computers, even the most advanced ones, are nowhere near powerful or stable enough to break real-world encryption. That's a critical distinction, and it's one Microsoft itself has been careful to acknowledge. But the absence of a working machine today doesn't mean the threat is theoretical for data that needs to stay secret for years or decades. This is where Harvest now, Decrypt Later, becomes the center of the story. Encrypted data doesn't have an expiration date. If a government agency, a corporation, or a hostile actor intercepts encrypted traffic today, whether it's classified government communications, corporate trade secrets, medical histories, or long-term financial records, they can simply store that data and wait. They don't need a quantum computer today to make the theft worthwhile. They need one at some point in the future, whenever that future arrives, to unlock everything they've been quietly stockpiling. For information that only needs to stay secret for a few years, this isn't much of a concern. But for information with a shelf life measured in decades, state secrets, long-term intellectual property, health records tied to genetic data, the calculation changes completely. If there's even a reasonable chance a capable quantum computer exists within the next 10 or 15 years, then encrypted data being stolen right now is already at risk, regardless of how far away that future machine actually is. Think about what that actually means in practice. A hospital system's encrypted genetic database, intercepted and copied today, doesn't need to be readable tomorrow to be dangerous. It needs to be readable at some point during a patient's lifetime, which could easily stretch 50 or 60 years into the future. A government's classified diplomatic cables, sitting encrypted on a stolen hard drive, don't lose their strategic value the moment they're captured. They lose it whenever the information inside finally becomes irrelevant, which for certain state secrets might never happen at all. Even something as mundane as a corporation's long-term product roadmap or merger negotiation could remain commercially sensitive for a decade or more. None of these scenarios require a quantum computer to exist right now. They only require someone patient enough to wait, and a growing number of security researchers believe that patience is already being exercised by well-resourced state actors around the world. That's the risk Microsoft is responding to, and it explains why the company's own explanation for the acceleration wasn't a single dramatic scientific breakthrough. When pressed by reporters about what specifically triggered the earlier deadline, Microsoft Azure's Chief Technology Officer, Mark Rusinovich, gave a notably measured answer. He said the decision was based on risk management rather than one specific event. In his words, shifting to quantum-resistant security takes years, and this is a proactive, risk-informed decision to help customers stay ahead of potential future threats. That's corporate language for something fairly simple. The timeline for the threat felt like it was shrinking, even if no single event proved exactly when the danger would arrive. So the company decided it was better to move early than to gamble on being late. And this is genuinely a company-wide shift, not a narrow technical patch. Microsoft says it's aiming to transition, in its own words, its entire portfolio of products and services to post-quantum cryptography by 2029. That includes the operating system running on desktops, laptops, and servers around the world. It includes Azure, the cloud platform that businesses, hospitals, and governments rely on to store and process enormous amounts of sensitive data. It includes Microsoft 365, Exchange, SharePoint, and the identity systems that verify who is logging into what. The company outlined 3 specific priorities driving this transition. First, upgrading network cryptography by adopting modern protocols like TLS-1. 3, the technology that secures the connection between your device and virtually every website you visit. Second, building what's called crypto agility into stored data, essentially designing systems so that cryptographic methods can be swapped out in the future without having to rebuild the underlying infrastructure from scratch. And third, transitioning the trust chains that secure code signing, certificate issuance, and software updates to quantum-resistant algorithms, the invisible verification systems that confirm the software installing itself on your machine is actually legitimate and hasn't been tampered with. Microsoft isn't alone in this shift. And that matters, because it shows this isn't one company's marketing strategy. It's an emerging industry consensus. Google has already committed to migrating its own infrastructure to be quantum secure by 2029, the same target year Microsoft has now adopted. Google also introduced a program within its Chrome browser specifically designed to ensure that the certificates verifying website security remain protected against future quantum threats. Cloudflare, which quietly powers the security and performance layer behind a significant portion of the internet's websites, has announced similar plans to reach quantum-safe infrastructure by that same 2029 deadline. Apple and Signal have already begun rolling out post-quantum cryptography into their own messaging platforms. When you see multiple competing tech giants, companies that rarely agree on much publicly, converging on the same urgency and the same rough timeline, that convergence itself becomes a signal worth paying attention to. It suggests this isn't hype generated by one company trying to sell a product. It's closer to an industry-wide recalibration of risk. There's also pressure coming from governments, not just corporations. Microsoft specifically pointed to guidance from the United States and France, both of which have called for the adoption of quantum-safe cryptography as early as 2030 for certain high-risk systems. National governments don't typically move quickly on speculative technology unless intelligence and security agencies are seeing something that concerns them. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, the U.S., agency responsible for setting cryptographic standards used across government and industry, has already finalized a set of post-quantum encryption algorithms designed to resist attacks from future quantum machines. That standardization process alone signals that this is being treated as a genuine planning requirement now, not a distant hypothetical reserved for science fiction. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. While Microsoft's cryptography teams are urging the world to prepare defensively, Microsoft's quantum hardware division has been making far bolder and far more controversial claims about how close a real working quantum computer actually is. In early June of 2026, Microsoft announced its latest quantum chip called Majorana 2, and alongside it, a genuinely striking claim. The company said it now believes it can build a useful, scalable quantum computer within roughly 3 years, cutting its previous timeline nearly in half. Chetan Nayak, the physicist leading Microsoft's quantum computing effort, said publicly that the company had previously talked about a scalable quantum machine on the 2033 timescale, but that recent accelerations could bring that timeline into 2029. Notice that number again. 2029 is showing up everywhere in this story, both as the year Microsoft wants its defenses ready, and, coincidentally or not, the year its hardware division now believes an actual breakthrough machine might exist. Microsoft's approach to building this machine relies on something called a topological qubit, built around theoretical particles known as Majorana fermions. The pitch behind this approach is compelling. Most qubits are extraordinarily fragile. They lose their delicate quantum state almost instantly when exposed to any noise from the surrounding environment, whether that's heat, vibration, or stray electromagnetic interference. That fragility is one of the biggest engineering obstacles standing between today's small experimental quantum computers and a machine powerful enough to actually threaten modern encryption. Topological qubits are theorized to be inherently more stable, protected by the physics of their own structure rather than requiring constant resource-intensive error correction. If Microsoft can actually build reliable topological qubits at scale, it could be a genuine shortcut past one of the field's hardest problems. But here's the catch, and it's a significant one. Not everyone in the physics community is convinced Microsoft has actually demonstrated what it claims. This isn't a minor academic squabble either. In June of 2026, a peer-reviewed critique was published in the journal Nature, directly challenging Microsoft's topological qubit claims. The author, physicist Henry Legg of the University of St. Andrews, argued that Microsoft's method for detecting the topological state, its qubits, relies on a flawed measurement protocol, and that the company's published data show signs of disorder rather than the clean, stable signal that would actually prove the technology works. According to Legg's analysis, the raw data, which Microsoft hadn't originally presented in full, appears to reflect a highly disordered system, with behavior that could plausibly be explained by ordinary electrons moving on and off small structures called quantum dots, rather than genuine evidence of the exotic particles Microsoft is claiming to have controlled. In plain terms, the critique argues that what Microsoft is calling a breakthrough might actually be a much more mundane electronic effect that only looks like the real thing if you're not looking closely enough. This isn't the first time Microsoft's quantum hardware claims have run into this kind of scrutiny either. Back in 2021, researchers whose work was funded by Microsoft were forced to retract an earlier paper in the same journal, Nature, after outside physicists identified serious problems with how the data had been presented. The original authors ultimately acknowledged what they described as insufficient scientific rigor. That history matters here because it means the current wave of skepticism isn't coming out of nowhere. It's a continuation of a pattern that specific corners of the physics community have been watching closely for years. And it's part of why some researchers remain cautious, even as Microsoft makes increasingly confident public statements. So where does that leave us? On one hand, you have Microsoft's security and cryptography teams making a fairly grounded, well-reasoned case for urgency. Their argument isn't that a quantum computer capable of breaking encryption already exists. It's that the transition takes years to complete safely across enormous, complex systems, and that waiting until the threat is definitively proven would likely mean waiting too long. That's a defensible conservative position, even if you're skeptical about exactly how close real quantum decryption capability actually is. On the other hand, you have Microsoft's hardware division making bold, headline-grabbing claims about a working quantum computer arriving within just a few years, claims that a published, peer-reviewed critique argues aren't fully supported by the underlying data. These are two different conversations happening under the same corporate umbrella, and it's worth being careful not to blur them together, even though the coverage often does exactly that. It's also worth pointing out that Microsoft isn't working entirely alone on the hardware side. The company has partnered with Quantinuum, a quantum computing company that recently went public on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol QNT, raising more than $1.5 billion in its initial public offering. Quantinuum and Microsoft have jointly demonstrated a system pairing Quantinuum's trapped ion quantum hardware with Microsoft's qubit virtualization software, reportedly achieving logical qubits, meaning stable, error-corrected units built from multiple physical qubits, with error rates roughly 800 times better than the raw physical qubits underneath them. That's a genuinely meaningful engineering result, even independent of the more contested Majorana claims, because error correction is widely considered one of the biggest practical hurdles standing between today's experimental quantum machines and anything close to a real-world threat to encryption. It's the kind of incremental, verifiable progress that tends to matter more in the long run than any single splashy announcement, precisely because it can be checked, repeated, and built upon by other researchers, rather than taken purely on faith. There's another piece of this story worth pulling out specifically, because it connects directly back to the operating system sitting on more than 1 billion machines around the world. At Microsoft's Build conference in 2026, quantum computing wasn't the headline act. Artificial intelligence dominated almost every keynote and demonstration. But tucked among the announcements was continued progress on the Majorana chip program, alongside a new security architecture called Microsoft Execution Containers, designed to provide device-level guardrails for increasingly capable AI systems running locally. Around the same time, Microsoft introduced its own in-house reasoning model, a sign that the company wants to control more of its own technology stack, rather than relying entirely on outside partners. Taken together, these moves suggest something worth noticing. Microsoft increasingly views Windows not simply as a place where you open apps and browse the web, but as a foundational platform where security, artificial intelligence, and eventually quantum-resistant infrastructure all have to coexist and evolve together. When the company that controls the world's dominant desktop operating system starts rebuilding its cryptographic foundations, that decision doesn't stay contained to cloud servers and corporate data centers. It eventually reaches the certificate store on your laptop, the update mechanism that patches your machine every month, and the trust chain that quietly verifies the software you install actually came from who it claims to. So what does all of this actually mean for you, the person watching this, who almost certainly isn't a physicist, a cryptographer, or a Fortune 500 chief technology officer? The honest answer is that for most individuals, this shift is happening in the background, largely invisible in the same way that most people never noticed when their browser quietly upgraded from older, weaker security protocols to newer ones years ago. If you use Windows, Microsoft 365, Azure-powered services, or virtually any major cloud platform, your data will likely be transitioned to quantum-resistant encryption over the next few years without requiring you to do anything at all. The companies handling your information are the ones absorbing the complexity of this transition, testing new algorithms for compatibility, rebuilding certificate systems, and slowly migrating trust chains behind the scenes. Where this matters more directly is for organizations handling long-lived sensitive information. Hospitals storing genetic and medical records that need to remain confidential for decades. Financial institutions managing long-term contracts and account histories. Government agencies handling classified material. Businesses protecting intellectual property that could remain commercially valuable for 20 or 30 years into the future. If you work in any of those spaces, or if your organization handles data with a similarly long shelf life, this is genuinely worth paying attention to now, not because a quantum computer is about to break into your systems next week, but because the process of migrating to quantum-resistant security is complicated, time-consuming, and expensive, and starting late tends to be far more costly than starting early. There's also a broader lesson buried inside this story that goes beyond quantum computing specifically. Large technology companies increasingly find themselves managing two very different kinds of forward-looking claims simultaneously. The first is defensive risk management, where the smart, responsible move is to prepare for a threat well before it's fully proven, because the cost of being wrong in the direction of caution is relatively low, while the cost of being wrong in the direction of complacency could be catastrophic. The second is competitive positioning, where being first to claim a breakthrough, first to announce a shortened timeline, first to capture headlines, carries enormous strategic and financial value, even if the underlying science hasn't been fully validated yet. Microsoft's July 2026 announcement blends both of these instincts into a single story, and untangling which parts are sober risk management and which parts are strategic positioning is exactly the kind of critical thinking worth applying to virtually every major tech announcement you encounter going forward, not just this one. A useful habit, when you see a headline like the one that likely brought you to this video, is to ask a simple question: which part of this claim is describing something that has already been measured and verified? And which part is describing something that hasn't happened yet, but is being presented with confidence anyway? In Microsoft's case, the acceleration of its cryptography timeline is a policy decision, something the company can genuinely control and commit to on its own schedule. The claim that a useful quantum computer will exist by 2029 is a prediction about physics and engineering that Microsoft doesn't fully control, and one that outside experts are actively disputing. Treating both statements with the same level of certainty is where a lot of the public confusion around this story comes from. Separating them doesn't mean dismissing either one. It just means giving each the appropriate amount of confidence it has actually earned. It's also worth acknowledging that skepticism toward Microsoft's specific hardware claims doesn't mean the broader quantum computing field is standing still or that the underlying risk is imaginary. Progress is happening across multiple companies and multiple approaches simultaneously. Google's own quantum research team separately disclosed improvements to quantum algorithms, specifically targeting the elliptic curve cryptography used to secure much of the modern internet, reportedly reducing the number of qubits and logical operations required compared to earlier theoretical estimates. That kind of incremental algorithmic progress, quietly happening in research papers rather than splashy press conferences, is often a more reliable signal of the field's actual trajectory than any single company's public roadmap. Quantum computing overall does appear to be moving forward, even if the exact pace and the specific milestones different companies claim to have already hit remain genuinely contested. So where does that leave the story Microsoft is telling? A large, historically dominant technology company is telling the world, in effect, that the quantum era is close enough that waiting to prepare is no longer the responsible choice. At the same time, that same company is facing legitimate, peer-reviewed scientific pushback on whether its own headline hardware achievement is actually what it claims to be. Both of these things can be true simultaneously, and understanding this story clearly means holding both of them in mind at once, rather than collapsing them into a single simple narrative of either breathless hype or dismissive skepticism. What seems fairly certain, regardless of how the Majorana debate ultimately resolves, is that the migration toward post-quantum cryptography is now underway across the industry, not as a speculative research project, but as an active engineering priority with real deadlines attached. Microsoft has set 2029. Google has set 2029. Cloudflare has aligned with the same target. Government guidance in the United States and France is pointing towards similarly aggressive timelines for high-risk systems. Whether or not a quantum computer capable of breaking real-world encryption exists by then, the infrastructure protecting your data is being quietly rebuilt on the assumption that it might, and that rebuilding effort touches operating systems, cloud platforms, browsers, and the invisible cryptographic handshakes happening every single time you open an app or visit a website. That's really the heart of why this story extends so far beyond a niche physics debate happening in the pages of Nature. It's why a topic that sounds like abstract science fiction, particles that might not even exist, computers that don't yet work as promised, has become a boardroom priority at some of the largest technology companies on Earth. Because in security, you don't wait until you're certain the threat has arrived. You prepare based on the reasonable chance that it might, especially when the cost of being wrong isn't measured in inconvenience, but in decades of stolen data quietly waiting to be unlocked. Microsoft just told the world in the clearest terms yet that it's no longer willing to bet against that chance. And whether the quantum computer that finally justifies this urgency arrives in 3 years, in 10, or later than anyone currently expects, the systems being built right now to defend against it are becoming very real, very fast. That shift alone, quiet as it may seem from the outside, might end up being one of the more consequential technology stories of this entire decade. Most technology stories ask you to pick a side, believe the hype, or dismiss it entirely. This one genuinely doesn't work that way. The responsible position is somewhere in the middle, taking the security transition seriously precisely because it's happening regardless of whether Microsoft's most ambitious hardware claims turn out to be true, while still applying healthy scrutiny to any single company's timeline for a breakthrough that hasn't been independently confirmed. The encryption protecting your data is being rebuilt right now, quietly, deadline by deadline, whether or not the machine that ultimately justifies the urgency ever arrives exactly on schedule. That, more than any single chip announcement, is the part of this story actually worth remembering.